Joining me now in the studio is Gemma Tetlow, who is Chief Economist for the Institute for Government. Talking today about the budget, but let's begin with the news breaking this morning from the Bank of England. What do you think of this package of measures that's been announced? Do you think that it will benefit in the way Mark Carney hopes it will, businesses and individuals as they try to navigate their way through whatever may happen with the coronavirus outbreak?
As we've approached the budget over the last few days, it's become increasingly clear that this is probably a day to think about how does government broadly defined support the economy through the shock of coronavirus. And it is quite significant that we've seen the Bank of England move this morning with monetary policy action on the same day that we're expecting to see fiscal policy action announced as well. Monetary policy is limited in what it can do because interest rates are already so low, and in a sense the particular type of economic shock that we've got from coronavirus, where people are being told to stay at home, stay away from the places they would normally spend money, means that the normal transmission mechanism for cutting the interest rate, which makes people feel a bit richer, puts more money in their pockets and means they might go out and spend money, actually may not work so well. So actually perhaps more significant from Mark Carney today was the announcements around extra borrowing capacity for businesses to help them through the next few weeks.
Which our guest a few minutes ago, former member of the Monetary Policy Committee, absolutely agreed with, that was more significant perhaps than the interest rate cut. In terms of the budget, how fundamentally do you think it's going to be affected, given what the government's promises were back in its election manifesto? How fundamentally affected is it going to be by coronavirus and by the need to respond to that?
I think we should really see today's budget announcements in sort of two parts. One part is trying to look through the coronavirus impact and see what does today's budget tell us about this government's longer term fiscal policy objectives. How much are they willing to borrow more than the previous government was? But I think a lot of the attention today will really be on the short-term measures. What is this budget saying about how the government will try and support the economy in the short term through the coronavirus hit? And given that monetary policy, there are limits to what that can achieve, it will be quite important to see what the government does on fiscal policy and supporting some of those groups who may be most severely affected, so those businesses that see many of their workers having to self-isolate, for example, and perhaps the self-employed who have less to fall back on.
But the government had talked about ensuring that revenue was sufficient so that it could pay for day-to-day spending in 3 years' time. So how can it assess whether the economic shock from coronavirus, and we don't know exactly when that is going to finish, that doesn't throw that off course? Or will the Chancellor perhaps say, we just can't stick to those targets?
The fiscal rules that were outlined in the Conservative manifesto said balance the budget, the current budget, within 3 years. That 3-year time horizon was there precisely to allow the government to respond to short-term shocks, so not to have to pull back support immediately, but to give themselves then 3 years to get back to balance.
So entirely manageable, you think?
Potentially. I think the question really is 3 years long enough for this temporary impact of coronavirus to pass through the economy? And that's as much an epidemiological question as an economic one. If we see something like the Spanish flu pattern that happened a century ago, that came back in 3 subsequent winters, suggesting that 3 years may not be long enough for all of that temporary shock to have moved through the economy. But quite interestingly today, we will see a set of official economic and fiscal forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility that were essentially produced and shut down before the impact of coronavirus really became apparent. So interestingly, we'll actually see some official forecasts for the path of borrowing that actually don't account for that full.
So it's a bit of a work in progress. I just want to ask you quickly on a couple of points that we might talk about in normal times when there isn't an outbreak of a virus going on. What key tax announcements do you think we might see today? And is this going to be a green budget, do you think, given the government's commitment to cutting its carbon footprint and the fact that Glasgow is hosting the huge UN climate conference later this year?
There's been a lot of toing and froing with rumours around what tax policies we might see in this budget. I think we probably are expecting to see some concrete things that were in the manifesto, so in increasing the threshold for paying national insurance contributions and cancelling the planned cut in corporation tax that was going to happen this April. We may well not see much on other policies. We may instead see some reviews announced for longer term changes. On the green tax side, I think that will be very interesting to watch. There is clearly a question about whether the government chooses to go ahead with inflationary increases in fuel duty in this budget. There's a lot of pressure on them not to do that. We haven't had one of those increases for the past decade, but it will give a sense of whether this government is able to persuade the public that they need to pay more for things like driving their cars. And if they're not able to push through those sorts of measures, it does raise questions about how we get to net zero, given the sorts of changes in people's own lifestyles that are going to be required to do that.
OK, Gemma, very good to hear from you this morning. Gemma Tetlow, Chief Economist for the Institute for Government.